Well, it's excellent to be here today, and I can't see any of you, so it's a little daunting.
That's a superstar effect.
Yeah, you're used to this, right? But again, thank you so much for this organizing, and I've got to say it's excellent to be in this type of environment. It's very different from the usual conference settings. But we're here to talk about governments, and of course you've had your introductions. Saqr, you've had yours as well. You've both done a lot for governance, from El Salvador to Puerto Rico, where you currently live. Right?
Yes.
Yes. Tell us a little bit about, well, actually, let's start with the presidency, because I think that's really exciting. How do you become president? What would you have done for this ecosystem right off the bat? And how would that have contributed to everything that we're doing?
There's I guess, a number of things. So first of all, I announced my run for president of the United States on July 4th of election year. So there's no way to win.
Right.
You can't, well, actually, there is a way to become president, but we'll not unpack that just yet, because you don't actually have to win the election to become president.
Right.
But that's something only a guy like me would figure out. Backdoors. The point of that was a reconnaissance mission. I ran as an independent. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to understand all the ways in which the system is rigged to prevent a non-Democrat or Republican from becoming president, and it's very rigged. And I understand most of the ways in which it is, which means as someone that runs, whether it be RFK Jr., Bobby Kennedy, who just announced his shift from a Democratic presidential candidate to an independent candidate right now, we understand the let's say the path. What would I have done had I been president, right now, had that election resulted in that?
And for the ecosystem.
Yeah, but for the ecosystem, it's things that I'm still already doing. I spend a lot of my time in Washington, D.C., in Congress. I mean, I think more than anyone that is, call it a builder in the industry. Mm-hmm. I probably spend more time walking the halls of Congress as an individual that's not brought in trade associations or lobbyists. And so that's having consistent conversations. One is making sure that the legislature doesn't put in place any rules or systems that harms the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And after what happened with FTX and Terra Luna and otherwise, we were in a very precarious place. It would have been very easy for some draconian legislation to be passed that could have very negatively impacted the U.S.'s participation. And so, fortunately, there are now many people, elected officials, that recognize the potential and importance of this technology. And so that hasn't happened. We didn't end up with those events resulting in very bad legislation. Legislation itself isn't bad. We just want sensible legislation. As I say, like technology. Technology isn't good or bad. Mm-hmm. None of it is. It's amoral. How we use it determines the impact it has. What our intentions are, legislation being no differently. There's good legislation and bad legislation. Now, unfortunately, most legislators don't know much about what this is. And so the potential for bad legislation is high, which is why it's so important that many of us are there on Capitol Hill, educating those that are in a position to do things, so that they're well educated and don't do something that causes great harm, with the law of unintended consequences. More recently, there's some really positive developments. Right now, it's been nearly a decade since applications for a Bitcoin ETF has been put in place that has very much negatively impacted the American people in terms of lack of accessibility. Mm-hmm. Most Americans, going back 10 years, 5 years, or arguably even today, with all that's happened, don't know how to responsibly open up an account, to be able to purchase Bitcoin or anything else, and to secure that with comfort and sleep well at night. For those that are newcomers or new entrants, to be able to use their Fidelity account, to be able to call their broker, and to safely be able to access Bitcoin through an ETF would have been great for the American people. Yeah. They missed out on a massive economic opportunity due to government, the SEC in particular, preventing the American people from having access. The good news is it looks like that's finally going to change, because the really big players like BlackRock and otherwise have finally said they want a Bitcoin ETF. We haven't had the political pull to get that done to date, but those that have it are here now. So I think that we're going to see that happen soon, which will have, I think, a pretty big impact on the market for everyone that is a hodler. So I think those things are changing. I could talk to you for hours about these things, but I think the main things there were making sure that we don't have legislation in place that's going to impact us negatively, and to start doing the things that open up the market, and also understanding that regulation through enforcement, getting a handle on the SEC and Gary Gensler, and making sure that he's not doing things to harm the U.S.'s role in innovation. I mean, what made America great is that we were the innovative capital of the world.
Right.
And the decisions that have been being made are negatively, it's forcing that innovation out of the country, which is good for places like this.
It's
But
great
we
for
want to
us.
spread it around, and we don't want America or the United States out of this. I think it's important that we're all participating, and everybody can win together.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I asked, what your dreams were when should you have become president? Because for all of us who work with governments, we have all of these grand dreams. We have worked on legislation, crypto legislation across various jurisdictions, but when it actually comes down to doing it and working with lawyers and all of the teams, a lot of that time, those frameworks come out very differently from what we had intended, which can be very negative in certain situations, but an enabler in others. And so I had meant to ask this to Dr. Marwan, but Saqr, maybe can you tell us a little bit about the framework here? And actually, I was really excited about the framework that came out last week that Minister Al-Alama announced. Do you know a little bit about the Responsible Metaverse Self-Governance Framework? We'd love to hear about it.
I think what the UAE did very early on, and this predates crypto, this predates, AI and all of it, was to align itself with innovation. And Sheikh Mohammed came out, I think it was the early 2000s, and he said, I want to be the first e-government in the region. And everyone was like, what are you talking about? This makes no sense. Then this e-government turned into m-government. And m-government turned into digital government. And digital government then had an IoT platform, and had an AI platform, and had an ERP platform, and then pivoted towards blockchain. I'm very proud and humbled by the fact that we were in the room suggesting this at the time, as early as 2014, to say, hey, there's a benefit for the UAE. And when we looked at this, we didn't just look at this independently, because blockchain really never exists in isolation. You said it so well. Blockchain is a team sport. You can't do it by yourself. Let's say you have the best blockchain in the world. If no one is using it, no good. So the Dubai government came out with this, at the time, the first strategy in the world on blockchain on a government level, right? To say we want to create thought leadership over here, we want to bring startups over here, and we as a government want to start adopting this. Later on, this trickled down to other emirates, so Ajman came out with a blockchain strategy, Sharjah came out with a blockchain strategy of some sorts. We started seeing use cases being implemented in Abu Dhabi as well. Do you need a water? Okay. All right, and then in 2018, we saw the Emirates blockchain strategy being announced. 2021, we then had the Dubai metaverse strategy, again, them taking the lead. And now we're going actively towards this thought leadership, driving this change and exporting it from here with initiatives like responsible AI, responsible metaverses, being able to govern your own assets in a way that is transparent, and where the government is not necessarily directly involved, but more of an enabler. And all of this runs under the happiness agenda, which is just fascinating.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's kind of similar to what we saw back in 2017 when there was no regulation around ICOs. And in South Korea, they got kind of all of the big players to come together and self-regulate.
Yeah.
That's kind of what, Dubai seems to be doing, at least at the outset with this. And then once you start to understand what's going on, then you can come in and bring in, great regulatory frameworks. So it's been, really exciting to see this journey. And it's been very interesting from a metaverse side because, we've been Of course, we have His Excellency Ambassador Abed here, who's been working on setting up the diplomatic mission in the metaverse, which is really interesting because it tests, principles of diplomacy, but also how does that work between, nation states, and how do we go about, setting up these frameworks become, really fascinating. That said, no, go ahead, Saqr.
No, and exactly that. So the European Union is as such one trade zone, one economic zone. There's transportability physically between all of the EU members. But when they started talking about blockchain adoption, they actually started fighting about it, right? Because I remember it was a very early use case where they wanted to track taxes on blockchain. And then France came out, and they said, we don't want Germany to know what taxes we're collecting. And again, it changes in a lot of ways, and this is what I commend the UAE for. It changes the way government works, and the UAE has said, we as a government want to be the enabler of the happiest people in the world. And when you start as a government, have constituents' happiness on your highest level, that's when innovation happens.
Brock, I have a question for you kind of on the flip side. So we have governments that are doing great and that are clearly bringing in, incredible amounts of companies. We have 1,000+ companies that have set up here in the last couple of years. Then you have governments that are doing nothing and or doing poorly. In the context where you have a government that is doing poorly, where they are failing us generally, and I'm not just talking about our industry, I'm talking about us as citizens in every possible way. Do you see another governance mechanism, and you've talked about your disruptive mechanism, but do you also see DAOs as being a governance mechanism we can utilize as people to come together to, set up our own types of frameworks or solve our own types of problems?
Absolutely. Might be worth taking a look at a book called More Equal Animals, written by Dan Larimer, who was one of my co-founders in Block One, or EOS. And I think one of the more interesting governance frameworks I've seen was called Eden, or the Eden Operating System, which was a first implementation of what we'd call a meritocracy. It's not a democratic governance layer, but a meritocratic governance layer, where you're enabling people to go through a process of electing members of a community, which could be any governance layer, potentially even a government, operating with resources flowing through that from a game theory perspective have prevented system capture. But all participants in that system are there by merit and have to have been chosen to participate to avoid, call it mob rule. And so it's worth looking at that system as a framework and concept. It's one of the best I've seen. It hasn't been rolled out successfully, only at subscale there, but it's not because of the architecture of the system. I find that to be a very fascinating one.
Are you testing it out?
Yeah. I was one of the founding 21 that launched that. I did do one tour of duty in elected office there, but we were only funding small sums of capital through it. But what happened is groups of those that are there by merit get elected. We all show up, call it 10 of us, and by merit, that have raised our hand to run for office, and I say, okay, I plan to fix the roads. You're like, I'm gonna make sure that everybody has clean drinking water. You're gonna say, well, I'm gonna make sure that we've got clean air. Here's my strategy, here's how I'm going to do it. If elected, here's what I'm going to do, which is very much public. Then amongst us, we decide whose idea is best, and water is life, we go with yours and say, you've got your plan to make sure that everyone in this particular geography, for example, here's how I'm going to make sure that everyone has clean drinking water. Right. I'm going to give every household basically this filtration system, and here's how it'll get implemented. And we decide that water is a good starting point. You get those resources from the system, and you actually go subcontract and hire and implement everything.
Interesting.
And so there's ways to do that if you created resources. And you can even create with these systems effectively a parallel governance system. They could be operating in unison with an existing failing, call it governance system, call it in a country that is, really, failed, which is, an unfortunate thing when people that are in a position of leadership, fail their people, and this is an inevitable thing. And you've got some that are effective leaders that are doing a great job like here, and you have some places in the world that are doing a terrible job, which may be due to corruption, it may be due just to poor execution, bad strategy. There's a lot of things that can lead to failure. Well, call it encumbered, too much debt can lead to these things. And there's a lot of that things that could lead to failure for the people. And I think that these frameworks do have the potential, to be implemented. And then you've got other systems that are running around the world. Craig Sellers and Phil Potter, two of my co-founders in Tether. We have another system right now called Self, which is a governance, your identity, a self-sovereign identity system that can be run globally, understanding that the foundation isn't even things like currency or a monetary instrument or an instrument of value. Ultimately, your identity, I think, is the foundational layer of everything and the attestation of who you are and what you are. There's a lot of systems that are being implemented that, can run in unison with government, in some cases can run parallel on a governmental layer, or at a community layer. I mean, you're seeing now all these community developments around the world that can build their own systems of governance, their own systems of value transfer, your own systems for commerce. I continue to be a big believer in the DAO concept, though we don't really have any, I'd call successful, what I'd call successful implementations. Yeah. And often those are also go back to system capture.
Agreed.
Right? And how do you get there? And that's what I like about Eden is the meritocracy, right? Leadership by merit. People that are there because they've proven, their ability and giving them then the ability to choose, how to proceed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the DAO model is really interesting because it just brings us back to our roots, like operating within communities. And it's wonderful when we have that model and we also have, a government with a vision that, like we do in the UAE, that creates, an enabling environment. And I will end with one thing because I think that the UAE has done a phenomenal job. Of course, the vision is a big part, but I think the, enabling ecosystem has been critical to the success and to bringing so many companies. When I arrived here in 2019, there weren't so many companies, and now we're at, thousands? And I think Crypto Oasis has done a lot to do that, to bring a lot of these companies here, as well as, all of the pioneers. Dr. Marwan, who's missing, was also...
Oh yeah, right here.
There we go. You play many roles, Saqr, but thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it and excited to trial some of these DAOs out.
Thank you very much. Give them a big round of applause, everyone. Alexia Heft and Brock Pierce.